I never expected my life to implode through a text message. But there it was, lighting up my phone on an otherwise normal Tuesday morning. Hey, just wanted to let you know we're planning to move in next month. The previous owner said it would be vacant by then. My name is Quinn, and until that moment, I thought I was the previous owner they were talking about. Except I hadn't sold my house. At least, I hadn't agreed to sell anything. There must be some mistake, I typed back, my hands shaking. I own this house, and it's not for sale. The response came quickly, we bought it last week. The paperwork's all signed. Maybe check with your husband. My stomach dropped. Ryan had been acting strange lately, distant, taking calls in other rooms, disappearing for hours on business meetings. But selling our house? That was impossible. He couldn't do that without my signature. Could he? I called Ryan's office, but his assistant said he was in meetings all day. Of course he was. I drove home anyway, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a scam. Maybe someone was trying to pull something. Maybe. I pulled into our driveway, my driveway, and saw Ryan's car there. So much for those meetings. The front door was unlocked. Inside, I found him in his home office, surrounded by boxes and packing tape. He didn't even look surprised to see me. You're home early, he said, like this was just another day. Someone texted me about buying our house, I said, watching his face carefully. Funny thing is, I don't remember putting it up for sale. He kept packing, not meeting my eyes. I was going to tell you tonight. Tell me what exactly? That I'm leaving. He finally looked up, and I didn't recognize the person staring back at me. The house is sold. I've already moved most of my money to a new account. My lawyer will be in touch about the divorce. The room started spinning. How did you sell the house without my signature? He smiled then, and it was cold. Remember last month when you signed those insurance papers I gave you? You should really read things more carefully, Quinn. I felt sick. Those papers had been thick, and I'd trusted him. After 12 years of marriage, I'd trusted him completely. Where am I supposed to go? My voice sounded small, even to me. That's not really my problem anymore. He sealed another box. You have 30 days to vacate. I'd start packing if I were you. I wanted to scream. To throw things. To demand answers. Instead, I asked the one question burning in my throat, why? Because I can, he said simply. And because my mother was right, you've always held me back. This way, we both get what we want. I get my freedom, and you get a lesson in paying attention. His mother. Of course Carol was involved. She'd never thought I was good enough for her precious son. Now it all made sense, the whispered phone calls, the sudden visits, the way she'd been smirking at me during Sunday dinners. I turned to leave, but stopped at the door. You know what's funny? I always defended you when people said you were just like your mother. Turns out they were right all along. His face darkened. Get out. Oh, I will, I said, finding strength in my anger. But don't think this is over. You and Carol might think you've won, but you have no idea what I'm capable of. I walked out of that house with nothing but my purse and my dignity. But as I drove away, I wasn't thinking about what I'd lost. I was thinking about Ryan's father, Henry, still recovering from his stroke in that fancy care facility. The facility that Carol managed all the finances for. Something told me Henry might be very interested in hearing about his son's recent activities. And I had 30 days to make sure justice was served, not just for me, but for everyone they'd ever betrayed. The Sunset Valley Care Center always smelled like artificial lavender and broken promises. I hadn't planned on visiting Henry today, but after my world imploded, he was the only person I could think to turn to. Ironic, considering he could barely speak since his stroke 3 months ago. I found him in the garden, parked in his wheelchair near the koi pond. His right side was still partially paralyzed, but his mind was sharp as ever. I could tell by the way his good eye tracked me as I approached. "Hey, Henry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Mind some company?" He gestured to the bench beside him with his working hand. As I sat down, I noticed his lunch tray was untouched. Carol was supposed to be handling his care, but the dried-out sandwich and cold soup told a different story. "They're not feeding you properly, are they?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Henry's face tightened, and he slowly shook his head. Then, with visible effort, he pointed to his jacket pocket. I reached in and found a crumpled piece of paper. As I unfolded it, my hand started trembling again. It was a bank statement. Henry's personal account had been nearly drained, with regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize. The dates matched up perfectly with when Carol took over his finances after the stroke. "Did you know about this?" I asked. Henry's good hand clenched into a fist. He nodded, then made a writing motion. I pulled out my phone's notes app and held it where he could type with his working hand. It took him several minutes, but what he wrote made my blood run cold. Ryan and Carol. Heard them planning. Selling house was just start. You heard them talking about selling my house? Another nod. He typed again, week before stroke. Carol said needed money. Ryan agreed help. The pieces started falling into place. Carol had always lived beyond her means, and Ryan had been complaining about his business struggling. They weren't just betraying me, they were stealing from Henry while he lay helpless in a hospital bed. "Why didn't you tell someone?" I asked. His finger trembled as he typed, "Stroke next day." Carol took phone. "Controls visitors." A nurse approached us, her face pinched with concern. "Mrs. Mitchell? I wasn't aware you were visiting today." Mrs. Carroll specifically requested to be notified of all visitors. "That's odd," I said, standing up. "Since I'm still legally Mrs. Mitchell for another 30 days, I have every right to visit my father-in-law." The nurse hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Of course, but nothing," I cut in. "In fact, I'd like to see Henry's care plan and visitor logs. Now." 20 minutes later, I was staring at documents that made my stomach turn. Carol had been systematically isolating Henry, restricting his visitors and even limiting his therapy sessions. The care plan she'd approved was bare minimum, despite Henry having excellent insurance coverage. I looked at Henry, seeing the fear and frustration in his good eye. "I'm not leaving you here like this," I said. "We're going to fix this." He typed slowly, careful. "Carol dangerous when cornered." "I know," I said, remembering the cold calculation in Ryan's eyes earlier. "But so am I." As I was leaving, my phone buzzed. A text from Carol, "Heard you visited Henry. Stay away from my family." I smiled grimly and typed back, "Funny, I was just about to text you the same thing." Another buzz, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually," I replied, "I think I'm finally starting to understand exactly what I'm dealing with." "See you soon, Carol." I turned off my phone and headed to my car, my mind already forming a plan. They thought they could isolate Henry and steal everything from both of us. But they'd forgotten something important. Before I was a video editor, I'd studied accounting. And I knew exactly how to follow a paper trail. Carol was right about one thing, though. This was about family. Just not the way she thought. Henry needed protection, and I needed allies. It was time to show Ryan and Carol what happened when you underestimate the people you're trying to destroy. The storage unit smelled like dust and secrets. I'd followed Carol here after she left the care facility, watching her punch in the gate code from my parked car down the street. Now, at 3 in the morning, I was picking through boxes of financial records she'd hidden away. My phone buzzed, a text from Mia, "You're insane. What if you get caught?" I ignored it, focusing on the documents in front of me. Carol had been busy. Investment accounts, property deeds, insurance policies, all in Henry's name, all being slowly drained or transferred. But something wasn't adding up. The amounts were too large for just Henry's assets. Then I found the letter. Ryan, I know you're having doubts. Carol's handwriting was shaky, unlike her usual precise script. But we've come too far to stop now. Quinn's house is just the beginning. Once we secure the rest of the properties from the trust, we'll have enough to. The letter trailed off there, but another document caught my eye. A trust agreement, dated 20 years ago. Henry's father had left properties to both Henry and Carol, but with conditions. They couldn't sell without mutual consent. Carol's signature was on recent transfer documents, but Henry's looked wrong. My hands shook as I took photos of everything. They hadn't just forged my signature on the house sale, they'd been forging Henry's signature on trust documents for months. A car door slammed outside. I froze, hearing footsteps approaching. There was nowhere to hide in the narrow unit. The footsteps stopped just outside. I know you're in there, Quinn. Ryan's voice. Of course Carol had set up surveillance cameras. You really should be more careful about following people, he continued. Mom saw you tailing her earlier. I stayed silent, my mind racing. The unit had no back exit. Come on out, he said, softer now. We can talk about this like adults. Like adults? I found my voice. Is that what you call forging signatures and stealing from your own father? A long pause. You don't understand the whole picture. I understand enough. I started gathering the documents I'd photographed. I understand that you and Carol are thieves. We're survivors, he snapped. Dad's trust was always meant to support both families. He just couldn't see that Mom deserved an equal share. So you decided to take it all? Including my house. The house was leverage. We needed you out of the way. His voice turned pleading. Quinn, listen. There's still a place for you in this. Mom's willing to cut you in, a fair share, no questions asked. All you have to do is walk away from Dad. I laughed, but it came out more like a sob. You really don't know me at all, do you? I know you're smart enough to take a good deal when it's offered. A metallic sound, he was raising the unit's door. I stepped back into the shadows, clutching the most damning documents. You're right about one thing. I am smart. Smart enough to make copies of everything I found tonight. He stepped into view, his face half lit by the security lights. You're bluffing. Check your phone. He pulled it out. I just sent him the photos, documents, signatures, Carol's letter, everything. That's just the start, I said. I have more. Much more. You'll regret this. But I heard the fear beneath his anger. No, Ryan. You and Carol are going to regret ever thinking you could get away with this. I walked past him, my heart pounding but my step steady. He grabbed my arm. We're not done, he hissed. Actually, we are. I pulled free. But hey, tell Carol something for me. Tell her I found the trust agreement. And tell her to check her own account balances. She might find some interesting transfers there too. His face went pale. I hadn't actually accessed Carol's accounts, but his reaction told me everything I needed to know. There was more to this scheme than even I had discovered. As I drove away, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Henry, be careful. More players involved. I smiled grimly. The game was getting bigger, but so were the stakes. And I was just getting started. Exhaustion hit me like a wave as I stared at my laptop screen, surrounded by takeout containers in Mia's spare bedroom. 3 days of digging through financial records had left me with bloodshot eyes and a growing sense of dread. You need to sleep, Mia said from the doorway, holding out a cup of tea. The documents will still be there in the morning. I can't. I pointed at the screen. Look at these transfers. They're not just stealing from Henry, they're moving money through dozens of accounts. Some of these names. I recognize them from the country club. Carol's friends. Mia sat beside me, squinting at the numbers. You think they're all involved? Before I could answer, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. Just an address and 3 words, midnight. Come alone. Don't even think about it, Mia said, reading over my shoulder. It's from Henry's old business partner, I said, recognizing the area code. He might know something. Or it could be Ryan setting you up. She had a point, but I was already grabbing my keys. I'll be careful. The address led to an all-night diner on the edge of town. Through the window, I saw an elderly man in an expensive suit, sitting alone in a corner booth. James Warner, I remembered him from Henry's retirement party 2 years ago. You're braver than I expected, he said as I slid into the booth. Or maybe just more desperate. Why am I here, Mr. Warner? He pushed a manila envelope across the table. Because Carol Mitchell made a mistake. She got greedy. Inside the envelope were more financial documents, but these were different. They showed massive transfers between shell companies, all leading back to a single source, the country club's renovation fund. Carol's been embezzling from the club? I asked. Warner's laugh was bitter. The club was just the beginning. She's been running this scheme for years, using Henry's business connections to set up fake investment opportunities. Ryan helped her expand it after Henry's stroke. But now? Now what? Now they're getting sloppy. Making promises they can't keep. People are asking questions. He leaned forward. Important people. People who don't like losing money. A chill ran down my spine. Why are you telling me this? Because I owe Henry. And because Carol's about to throw Ryan under the bus to save herself. She's meeting with the club board tomorrow to pin everything on him. My hands clenched under the table. She'd do that to her own son. Carol Mitchell would sacrifice anyone to save herself. He stood up, dropping some cash for his untouched coffee. What you do with this information is up to you. But be careful, cornered rats bite hardest. I sat there long after he left, staring at the documents. My phone buzzed, a text from Ryan, we need to talk. Please. Then another from Carol, stay away from my son. And finally, one from Henry, don't trust anyone. Not even me. My head was spinning. Ryan was about to take the fall for years of fraud, orchestrated by his own mother. Part of me wanted to let it happen, he deserved it after what he'd done to me. But another part remembered the boy who'd once stayed up all night helping me edit my first video project. The man who'd held my hand through my father's funeral. My phone buzzed again. A video message from an unknown number. I pressed play. It showed Carol in what looked like a hotel room, arguing with someone off camera. Quinn knows too much, she was saying. We need to handle this now, before. The video cut off abruptly. My hands were shaking as I gathered the documents. Warner's warning echoed in my head, cornered rats bite hardest. Carol wasn't just trying to save herself anymore, she was actively threatening me. I walked out of the diner into the cold night air, my mind racing. I had evidence of their crimes, but using it meant putting Ryan in prison. Not using it meant letting Carol win. And somewhere in the middle was Henry, still vulnerable in that care facility. The game had changed. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about survival. And I had to decide, right now, how far I was willing to go to protect not just myself, but everyone caught in Carol's web of lies. The country club's annual charity gala was in full swing when I walked in wearing the black dress I'd bought for my anniversary, an anniversary that would never come. Ironic that my first public appearance since Ryan's betrayal would be here, surrounded by the very people who'd helped Carol steal millions. I spotted her holding court near the champagne fountain, Ryan hovering nervously at her side. They both froze when they saw me. Quinn, Carol's smile was razor-sharp. I don't recall seeing your name on the guest list. I held up my invitation. Courtesy of James Warner. He thought I should be here for the big announcement. Ryan's face went pale. Carol's grip tightened on her champagne flute. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said, but her voice wavered slightly. Really? The board meeting didn't go as planned this morning? I moved closer, lowering my voice. Throwing your own son under the bus must have been difficult. You don't know what you're talking about, Ryan cut in, but his eyes darted to his mother. Show them, a quiet voice said behind me. Henry, wheeled in by his new private nurse, the one I'd hired after moving him to a better facility. Show them what we found. I pulled out my phone, pulling up the video Warner had sent me. Carol's face drained of color as her own voice filled the air between us. Ryan's signature is on everything. He'll take the fall, and we'll be free to. She snatched the phone from my hand. You're making a mistake. The mistake was thinking you could get away with this, I said, loud enough for nearby guests to turn. The club's money, Henry's trust, my house, did you really think no one would notice? Mother? Ryan's voice cracked. What is she talking about? Carol's composure cracked. I did it for you. Everything I've done has been to secure your future. The room had gone quiet. Club members were staring, whispering. I saw James Warner by the door, nodding slightly. My future? Ryan laughed bitterly. You mean the future where I go to prison while you run away with everything? No one is going to prison, Carol snapped, but her eyes were wild. Quinn, let's discuss this privately. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. Like the arrangement you made with the board? I asked. Blaming everything on Ryan while you walk away clean. You don't understand, she hissed. I had no choice. The investments went bad, people were asking questions. Someone had to take responsibility. And that someone had to be your son. Ryan stepped back from his mother like she'd struck him. The investments. They were never real, were they? It was all just a scheme. Carol reached for him, but he jerked away. Ryan, please. Everything I did was for yourself, Henry finished, his voice stronger than I'd heard in months. Always for yourself, Carol. She spun toward him, fury replacing fear. You don't get to judge me. You and your self-righteous morality, always making me feel small. Well, I took what I deserved. The confession hung in the air. Someone gasped. I saw phones recording, heard the murmurs growing louder. Mrs. Mitchell. A man in a dark suit approached. I'm Detective Roberts. We'd like to ask you some questions about the club's finances. Carol's face contorted. She looked at Ryan, then me, then back at her son. Ryan, tell them. Tell them you knew about the investments. Tell them you helped. But Ryan was already walking away, shoulders slumped, leaving his mother to face the consequences alone. As the detective led Carol away, I felt Henry's hand on mine. You did it, he said softly. We did it, I corrected, watching Ryan disappear through the club's doors. But it doesn't feel like winning. Justice rarely does, Henry replied. The question is, what happens next? I didn't have an answer. The storm had broken, but the aftermath was just beginning. And somewhere in the wreckage of this family, I had to find a way forward, not for revenge anymore, but for healing. The police station's fluorescent lights made everything look sickly and unreal. I sat across from Detective Roberts, watching him flip through the evidence I'd gathered, evidence that now seemed to be working against me. Mrs. Parker, he said, using my maiden name for the first time since the investigation began. Can you explain these transfers from Henry Mitchell's account to yours? My throat went dry. Those were for his care expenses. I've been managing. Without power of attorney. He slid another document across the table. And these withdrawals from the club's renovation fund? That was Carol, I started, but he cut me off. Carol Mitchell claims you orchestrated the whole scheme. She has documentation showing you accessed these accounts first, months before she did. The room started spinning. I'd been so focused on exposing Carol that I hadn't noticed her laying her trap. She'd somehow backdated transactions, making it look like I'd started everything. My phone buzzed, a text from Ryan, "Take the deal. Please." The deal had arrived through Carol's lawyer this morning. I could walk away with the house and a settlement if I took responsibility for the financial fraud. Carol would claim she'd been trying to stop me, and Ryan would back her story. "I need a moment," I told the detective, stepping out into the hallway where Mia waited. "They're trying to frame you," she said, hugging me. "We can fight this. Can we?" I showed her my phone, another text, this time from Carol, "Think about Henry. Prison would kill him at his age." She'd found a way to turn my protection of Henry against me. If I fought back, they'd implicate him too. The timestamps on the documents would support their story that he'd been aware of everything. "Quinn." Henry's voice made me turn. He'd wheeled himself down the hallway, looking friendlier than ever. "I heard what they're saying." "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I thought I was helping, but I just made everything worse." "No." His good hand gripped mine. "You woke me up. Made me see what Carol really was. But now." He glanced at the detective's door. "Maybe it's time to let go." "Let go?" I stared at him. "After everything they did?" "Sometimes winning means walking away," he said softly. "I've lost my wife to greed and my son to fear. I can't lose you too." Another text buzzed, "Final offer. Decision needed within the hour." I slid down the wall, sitting on the cold floor. Everything I'd fought for was unraveling. The evidence I'd gathered had been twisted against me. The justice I'd sought had become another weapon in Carol's arsenal. And now Henry, the person I'd most wanted to protect, was asking me to surrender. "There's something else," Mia said quietly, showing me her phone. A news article about the club's investigation included quotes from members defending Carol, claiming I'd manipulated her into covering for my schemes. My reputation was being destroyed in real time. The detective's door opened. "Mrs. Parker. We need your statement now." I looked at Henry, seeing the worry in his eyes. At Mia, whose face showed both support and fear. At my phone, where Ryan's latest message glowed, "Mom always wins. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'll be right there," I told the detective. As I stood up, Henry caught my hand again. "Whatever you decide," he said, "remember who you are. Not who they say you are." I walked back into the interrogation room, my mind racing. Carol had outmaneuvered me at every turn. She'd used my own evidence against me, turned my allies into liabilities, and forced me into an impossible choice. Take the fall or watch Henry suffer. The detective pushed a statement form across the table. "Ready to tell us what really happened?" I picked up the pen, feeling its weight like a sentence. Everything I'd done to expose the truth had only led me deeper into Carol's web. Now I had to decide, was justice worth the cost? Or was Henry right, was walking away the only way to truly win? The pen hovered over the paper as the clock ticked down on Carol's ultimatum. Whatever I wrote next would change everything, and there was no going back. I set my phone on the interrogation room table, pressed play, and watched Detective Roberts' expression change. "I know what you're planning." Henry's voice, stronger than I'd heard in months, filled the room. "You're going to frame Quinn for everything." "Of course we are." Carol's recorded voice was smug. "The timestamps are already altered. The paper trail leads to her. Ryan's on board." "And the real documents?" Henry asked. "Hidden where no one will find them. Once Quinn takes the fall, we'll." I stopped the recording. "There's more. Hours more. Henry's been recording everything since his stroke. Turns out being the silent invalid in the corner has its advantages. The detective leaned back. Where did you get this? From me. Henry wheeled himself in, followed by 2 FBI agents. I've been working with them for months. Long before Quinn knew anything about Carol's schemes. Carol burst into the room, Ryan trailing behind her. You can't, she froze when she saw the agents. Actually, we can, one agent said. We've been investigating the club's finances for over a year. Henry's recordings just gave us the final piece. You're bluffing, Carol snarled, but her hands were shaking. Ryan, tell them. Tell them Quinn was behind everything. Ryan looked at me, then at his father. The facade cracked. I can't. Not anymore. You weak, pathetic. Carol lunged for my phone, but the detective caught her arm. Carol Mitchell, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. As they read her rights, she thrashed against the handcuffs. I did everything for this family. Everything. And you, she spat at Henry, you betrayed me. Your own wife. No, Carol. Henry's voice was sad but firm. You betrayed yourself. The money, the schemes, they became more important than family. Than love. Love? She laughed bitterly. Love doesn't pay bills. Love doesn't secure futures. I protected us. Protected us. Ryan's voice cracked. You were going to let Quinn go to prison. You were stealing from your own husband. From our friends. That's not protection, Mother. That's destruction. Carol's face crumpled. For a moment, I saw something real beneath the manipulation, fear, desperation, maybe even regret. Then it hardened again as the agents led her away. Ryan turned to me. Quinn, don't. I held up my hand. Just. Don't. I should have stood up to her sooner. Should have told you everything. Yes, you should have. I looked at the man I'd once loved, seeing him clearly for the first time. But you didn't. And that's something you'll have to live with. The detective cleared his throat. Mr. Mitchell, we'll need your statement about your involvement. Ryan nodded, defeated. I'll tell you everything. As they led him away, Henry touched my hand. You could have taken the deal. Walked away with the house, with security. The house wasn't worth my integrity. I squeezed his hand. And neither was revenge. It wasn't revenge, he said quietly. It was justice. For both of us. Mia appeared in the doorway, grinning. The FBI agent said they found Carol's hidden documents. Everything's there, the real timestamps, the transfer records, all of it. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow. What happens now? Now, Henry said, we rebuild. Not what was, but what could be. I looked at the empty doorway where Carol and Ryan had disappeared. The path of destruction they'd carved through our lives was still there, but it no longer defined us. They'd tried to bury me, not realizing I was a seed. Quinn. Mia held up her car keys. Ready to go home. Home. Not the house Ryan had sold out from under me. Not the life Carol had tried to steal. But something new, something honest. Yeah, I said, helping Henry maneuver his wheelchair toward the door. Let's go home. Behind us, I could still hear Carol's voice echoing down the hallway, demanding her lawyer. But for the first time since this all began, I didn't need to look back. The future, uncertain as it was, lay ahead. 6 months later, I stood in front of my old house, watching the new owners plant spring bulbs in what used to be my garden. Their little girl chased a butterfly across the lawn, her laughter carrying on the breeze. It didn't hurt anymore, seeing someone else living my old life. Ready? Henry asked from the passenger seat of my car. His speech had improved dramatically since starting the new therapy program. Almost. I pulled an envelope from my purse, Carol's letter, discovered among the documents the FBI had recovered. I hadn't opened it yet, wasn't sure I wanted to. You don't have to read it, Henry said quietly. I know. But I did. Not for closure, I'd found that already, but for understanding. The letter was dated the day before everything fell apart. Ryan, I'm scared. Everything's spinning out of control. Quinn's getting too close, and I can't see a way out that doesn't destroy us all. Maybe that's what I deserve. I spent so long trying to protect us from ending up like my parents, broke, desperate, ashamed, that I became something worse. You deserved better than a mother who taught you to fear poverty more than dishonesty. Henry deserved better than a wife who saw him as a bank account instead of a partner. And Quinn. She saw through me from the beginning. That's why I had to destroy her. Because she reminded me of who I used to be, before fear ate away at everything good inside me. The letter ended there, unfinished, unsent. I folded it carefully and let the wind take it from my fingers. The sentencing is tomorrow, Henry reminded me gently. Carol was facing 15 years. Ryan had made a deal for 5, with restitution. The club members who'd lost money were being repaid, and Henry's assets had been restored. Justice, by any legal definition. Mia's waiting at the new place, I said, starting the car. She's convinced the feng shui needs adjusting before we move in. Henry chuckled. That woman would rearrange the stars if she could. The new place was actually an old craftsman house we'd bought together, Henry with his restored savings, me with my share of the recovered funds. 2 separate apartments under one roof, a fresh start for both of us. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Mia sage smudging the front porch. But it was the figure beside her that made me pause, Ryan, holding a box. He asked to help with the move, Henry said. I told him it was your decision. Ryan looked thinner, older. Prison hadn't started yet, but the weight of consequences had already changed him. He set the box down when he saw us. I can go, he said. I should have felt anger, seeing him here. Instead, I felt something closer to pity. The boxes in the truck need unloading, I said. Just don't break anything else. He nodded, understanding all the layers in that statement. Inside, Mia had arranged crystals in every window. For protection, she explained. And new beginnings. Speaking of new beginnings, Henry pulled out a small wrapped package. For your office. Inside was a framed photo, not of family or friends, but of a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. Below it, a simple inscription, growth requires destruction. Carol sent it, Henry said quietly. From prison. I traced the butterfly's fragile wings through the glass. She finally understood, didn't she? Too late, but she understood. It's never too late to understand, Henry said. Only to change the past. Outside, Ryan was carefully carrying boxes up the porch steps. Mia was singing something about cleansing energies. And through the window, I could see the mountains where I'd build my new editing studio. Where I'd tell other people's stories until I was ready to tell my own. You know what the funny thing is? I said to Henry. I thought this whole journey was about revenge. About justice. But it was really about transformation. He smiled, squeezing my hand. The best revenge is becoming exactly who you were meant to be. I hung the butterfly photo in my new office, where the morning light would catch its wings. Some things had to break before they could become beautiful. Some people had to lose everything to find themselves. And sometimes, the greatest act of revenge was simply learning how to fly.
I never knew my father. He died when I was just 3, leaving behind nothing but a handful of photos and a single video of him holding me as a baby. My name's Elizabeth, and this is my story. Growing up with my mom wasn't easy. She was always afraid of being alone, cycling through boyfriends faster than I could learn their names. It was a revolving door of men, each one leaving as quickly as he came. The only stability in my life came from my grandmother, my mom's mother. She was my rock, my safe haven. Whenever things got too chaotic at home, which was often, Grandma would swoop in and take me to her place. "Come on, Elizabeth," she'd say, her voice warm and comforting. "Let's go make some cookies." Those weekends at Grandma's were like entering a different world. Her house was always quiet, peaceful. No shouting, no slamming doors, no strange men stumbling around in the middle of the night. Just me and Grandma, baking cookies, reading books, or tending to her small garden. I often wondered about my dad's parents. Mom told me they'd cut ties after Dad died, disapproving of her moving on so quickly. But I suspected there was more to the story. Mom wasn't exactly reliable when it came to the truth. School was my escape. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I enjoyed learning, but mostly because it was a distraction from the chaos at home. Mom was rarely involved in my education, or anything else in my life for that matter. I learned to be independent out of necessity. By the time I was 10, I was cooking my own meals, doing my own laundry, and helping myself with homework. Mom was too busy chasing her next relationship to bother with such trivial things. Everything changed when I turned 12. Mom finally got married to a man named Frank. She was over the moon, convinced he was her last chance at happiness. "This is it, Lizzie," she gushed. "We're finally going to be a real family." But Frank had other ideas. From day one, he made it clear that I was an inconvenience, a reminder of Mom's past that he'd rather forget. "Listen up, kid," he growled at me on the first night he moved in. "I don't want to see or hear you unless it's absolutely necessary. You stay in your room and keep out of our way. Got it?" Life under Frank's rule was a far cry from anything resembling a real family. He ruled our house with an iron fist, and I quickly learned that silence and invisibility were my best defenses. "You think you can just freeload off us?" Frank would snarl. "You're gonna earn your keep, girl." And earn it I did. Every penny spent on me was accounted for and expected to be repaid through chores and perfect grades. While my classmates sported new clothes and the latest phones, I shuffled around in hand-me-downs, clutching the ancient Nokia my grandmother had given me. Why can't I have new clothes like everyone else? I once dared to ask Mom. Her response was quick and dismissive. "We can't afford it, Lizzie. Be grateful for what you have." But I knew better. I'd seen the designer bags Mom brought home, heard the plans for weekend getaways with Frank. There was money, just not for me. At school, I stuck out like a sore thumb. But to my surprise, my classmates were kind. They never teased me about my outdated clothes or ancient phone. Instead, they often went out of their way to help. "Hey Liz, want a ride home?" Sarah, a girl from my math class, would often ask. Her mom would smile warmly at me from the driver's seat, a stark contrast to the cold shoulder I got at home. I'd gratefully accept, knowing the alternative was a long walk home. Mom and Frank had made it clear that picking me up from school was not on their list of priorities. "You've got 2 legs, don't you?" Frank would say. "Use 'em." At home, there was no rest. Frank had an endless list of chores for me to complete. Cleaning, cooking, laundry, the work never stopped. And heaven forbid if I tried to take a break. "What do you think you're doing?" Frank's voice would boom if he caught me sitting idly. There's always work to be done in this house. Homework was to be completed perfectly, with Frank regularly checking my grades. Anything less than excellent was unacceptable. "A B-, he roared one day, waving my report card in my face. "You think that's good enough? No TV for a week. And forget about seeing your little friends." I'd nod silently, fighting back tears. The punishments were harsh, but arguing only made things worse. So I'd retreat to my room, bury my face in my pillow, and let the tears flow silently. Weekends at Grandma's became my lifeline. But even those were under threat. Frank had discovered a new form of punishment, denying me my visits to Grandma's house. "You failed that history test," he'd say with a cruel smile. "Looks like you'll be staying home this weekend to study." It broke my heart to lie to Grandma when she called, worried about my absence. "I'm sorry, Grandma," I'd say, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. "I've just got so much schoolwork. I'll come next weekend, I promise." But next weekend would come, and Frank would find another reason to keep me home. It was a vicious cycle, and I felt powerless to break it. As I approached my 15th birthday, I made a decision. I needed some independence, some way to escape the suffocating control at home. So I applied for a job at the local diner. To my surprise, Frank approved. "About time you started contributing," he grunted. The diner became my sanctuary. The owner, a kind-hearted woman named Marge, took me under her wing from day one. She was everything my mother wasn't: caring, attentive, and genuinely interested in my life. She'd often let me leave early, especially on weekends. Those stolen hours with Grandma were precious. I'd arrive at her house, breathless and grinning, and she'd welcome me with open arms. "Elizabeth, my dear, what a lovely surprise," she'd exclaim, pulling me into a warm hug. I never told Grandma the whole truth about life at home. I couldn't bear to see the worry in her eyes, or worse, risk her confronting Mom and potentially losing my visitation rights altogether. So I kept my struggles to myself, painting a rosier picture than reality. As my 18th birthday approached, a tiny spark of hope flickered in my chest. Maybe, just maybe, things would change. Perhaps Mom and Frank would finally see me as an adult, worthy of respect and kindness. How naive I was. The morning of my 18th birthday, I woke up with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I got dressed carefully, putting on the nicest outfit I owned, a hand-me-down blouse from a cousin and a skirt I'd found at a thrift store. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my room, half expecting balloons or a happy birthday banner. Instead, I was met with Mom's cold stare. "Oh good, you're up," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I have news. I'm pregnant. We'll need your room for the baby. You can go wherever you want, but you can't stay here anymore." I stood there, stunned. Of all the scenarios I'd imagined for my 18th birthday, this hadn't even been on the list. "But, this is my home," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom's eyes hardened. "This is my house, Elizabeth. You've been a burden on Frank for far too long. I need a calm environment for my pregnancy, and frankly, you stress him out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A burden? A source of stress? Was that all I was to them? "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, fighting back tears. Mom shrugged, her indifference like a knife to my heart. "Go live with your grandmother. Get a job. I don't have money for college, so you're on your own there. But I expect you to come back daily to clean the house while Frank's at work. I can't do it in my condition." With that, she thrust a hastily packed bag into my hands and all but pushed me out the door. The lock clicked behind me with a chilling finality. I stood on the porch, my meager possessions at my feet, trying to process what had just happened. On my 18th birthday, instead of celebration, I'd been discarded like yesterday's trash. I trudged up the familiar path to Grandma's house, my eyes red and puffy from crying. Before I could even knock, the door swung open, and there stood Grandma, her face lighting up at the sight of me. "Elizabeth, happy birthday, my dear," she exclaimed, pulling me into a warm embrace. Then, noticing my tear-stained face and the bag at my feet, her expression shifted to concern. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" I broke down again, sobbing into her shoulder as I recounted the morning's events. Grandma listened, her face a mix of shock and anger. "That girl. I can't believe she'd do this to her own daughter," she muttered, shaking her head. Then, squeezing my shoulders gently, she said, "Well, you're always welcome here, Elizabeth. Always." She ushered me inside, where I was greeted by the mouth-watering aroma of freshly baked cookies, my favorite chocolate chip ones. "I was hoping you'd stop by today," Grandma said with a wink. "Come on, let's get some food in you." As I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by all my favorite treats, I felt the knot in my chest begin to loosen. Grandma bustled around, pouring me a glass of milk and piling a plate high with cookies, mini sandwiches, and fruit. "Now," she said, sitting across from me, "we're not going to let your mother's foolishness ruin your special day. Why don't you call up some of your friends? We'll have a little party right here in the backyard." Overwhelmed with gratitude, I hugged her tightly before reaching for my phone. Within an hour, several of my classmates had arrived, bearing gifts and warm wishes. The backyard was soon filled with laughter and chatter. The smell of grilling burgers and hot dogs wafted through the air as we played games, shared stories, and simply enjoyed each other's company. For the first time in years, I felt truly celebrated. As the afternoon wore on, I made frequent trips into the house to refill the pitcher of Grandma's famous homemade lemonade. During one such trip, I overheard Grandma on the phone in the living room. "Yes, that's right. It's time," she was saying, her voice low but firm. "I think you should come as soon as possible. Tomorrow morning would be perfect." I paused, curious. Who was she talking to? And what was it time for? But before I could ponder further, I heard her wrapping up the call. "All right, I'll see you then. Thank you," she said before hanging up. When I entered the living room with the refilled pitcher, Grandma was there, smiling as if nothing had happened. "Having fun, dear?" she asked brightly. I nodded, deciding not to ask about the mysterious phone call. Whatever it was, I trusted Grandma. After all, she was the one person who had never let me down. The morning after my birthday, I woke up in Grandma's guest room, feeling more rested than I had in years. I was helping Grandma with the dishes when there was a knock at the door. To my utter shock, it was Mom. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Can we talk?" I stood frozen, unsure how to respond. Grandma gently squeezed my shoulder and nodded, so I stepped aside to let Mom in. She looked different. Smaller somehow, and definitely nervous. In her hands, she clutched a gift-wrapped package. "I'm sorry about yesterday," Mom began, her eyes darting around the room. "I don't know what came over me. Here, I got you a birthday present." I took the package mechanically, too stunned to speak. "Please, Elizabeth," Mom continued, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "Come home. We can work this out." Grandma, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, dear," she said to Mom, her tone firm but not unkind. "But I'm afraid it's too late to change things now." Mom opened her mouth to argue, but at that moment, the front door opened. An elderly couple stepped in, and I watched in confusion as all the color drained from Mom's face. "Hello, Elizabeth," the woman said warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Happy belated birthday." The man beside her smiled and added, "We've been waiting a long time to meet you, sweetheart." Grandma stepped forward. "Elizabeth, these are your paternal grandparents. I asked them to come." My mind was reeling. The grandparents I'd never known, the ones Mom had always said wanted nothing to do with me, were here? And Grandma had invited them? They enveloped me in a warm hug, and I found myself instinctively relaxing into their embrace. "We have a lot to tell you, Elizabeth," my grandfather said, his voice gentle but firm. "Starting with the truth about your home." Over the next hour, they unraveled a story that left me speechless. The house I'd grown up in, the one I'd been unceremoniously kicked out of just yesterday, actually belonged to me. It had been left to me by my father and put in my name by my paternal grandparents after his death. "Your mother was allowed to live there with you," my grandmother explained, shooting a pointed look at Mom, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "But now that you're 18, it's your decision who lives there." I sat there, trying to process this bombshell. All those years of feeling like a burden, of being told I should be grateful for a roof over my head, and the house had been mine all along? "I own the house?" I stammered, my mind struggling to grasp this new reality. My grandparents nodded, while Mom sat silent. As I sat there, still reeling from the revelation about the house, my paternal grandmother gently took my hand. There's more, Elizabeth, she said, her voice soft but firm. My grandfather nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resolve. We've been sending your mother a monthly allowance ever since your father passed away, he explained. It was meant to cover your expenses, clothes, school supplies, anything you needed. I felt my jaw drop. All those years of wearing hand-me-downs, of being told we couldn't afford new clothes or school trips. Had it all been a lie? We wanted to be part of your life, to help raise you, my grandmother continued. But your mother, she was against it. I glanced at Mom, who was standing in the corner of the room, her face a mask of discomfort and shame. We didn't want to cause any trouble, my grandfather added. So we kept in touch through your grandmother here. She's been sending us photos and updates about you all these years. Grandma nodded, squeezing my shoulder supportively. And that's not all, my grandmother said. We've been saving for your college education. We gave the money to your mother to set aside for you. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. College money? I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. I turned to Mom, who was now visibly squirming. You told me there was no money for college. You told me I was on my own. The room fell silent, all eyes on my mother. She opened and closed her mouth several times, no words coming out. Finally, Grandma spoke, her voice uncharacteristically stern. Tell her the truth, Amanda. You owe her that much. Mom's face cycled through various shades of red and white. We, she stammered, then took a deep breath. Frank and we spent the money. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt like I was in a surreal dream, or rather, a nightmare. You did what? My paternal grandmother's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife. Mom flinched. We needed it. We bought a car, she finally blurted out. A car, my grandfather repeated incredulously. A luxury car, Mom added, as if that somehow made it better. We needed it. Frank's job, appearances are important, you know. I stared at her, unable to comprehend the level of selfishness and deceit. All those years of scrimping and saving, of being told I was a burden, and they had been living it up with money meant for me? The room fell into a stunned silence as the magnitude of my mother's betrayal sank in. I felt a surge of anger rise within me, hot and fierce. You're a fraud, I spat out, my voice trembling with rage. You kicked me out of my own house after robbing me blind for years. Mom's eyes widened, and she held up her hands defensively. No, Elizabeth, you've misunderstood everything, she pleaded. I was going to surprise you for your birthday. I was going to tell you about the house and the money. I couldn't help it, I let out a bitter laugh. Oh, you surprised me all right, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Kicking me out on my 18th birthday was quite the surprise. Congratulations, Mom. Mission accomplished. My paternal grandfather stepped forward, his face stern. Amanda, he said, addressing my mother, you need to return the money for Elizabeth's education. Immediately. Mom's face contorted with anger. I'm not giving anything back, she shrieked. Do you have any idea how hard it's been raising her on my own? That money is compensation for everything I've done. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything you've done? I echoed incredulously. You mean neglecting me, making me feel like a burden, and stealing from me? Mom turned to me, her eyes wild. Elizabeth, stop this nonsense and come home right now, she demanded. Something inside me snapped. It's my house, and I want you and Frank out. Now. Mom's face crumpled, and she pointed at her stomach. But I'm pregnant, she whimpered. You can't throw us out. Where will we go? I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, just a profound weariness. I could see that while her pregnancy might be real, her tears were just another manipulation tactic. That's not my problem, I said quietly. You should have thought about that before you stole my future. Grandma stepped forward and put her arm around my shoulders. "I think it's time for you to leave, Amanda," she said firmly. "You've done enough damage." As Mom continued to sob and plead, my paternal grandparents exchanged a look. "We'll be pursuing legal action to recover the stolen funds," my grandfather stated. "And we'll be helping Elizabeth secure her property." I watched as my mother's face cycled through shock, anger, and fear. For the first time, I saw her for what she truly was, not the loving mother I'd always longed for, but a selfish, manipulative woman who had put her own desires above her child's well-being. The weeks following that fateful confrontation were a whirlwind of legal consultations, paperwork, and emotional upheaval. With the support of my grandparents, both sets of them, I found the strength to stand up for myself and pursue justice. We filed multiple lawsuits, one for compensation for moral damages, another for the misuse of the monthly allowance my paternal grandparents had been sending, and a third for the return of my college fund. Each document I signed felt like a step towards reclaiming my life. The most difficult lawsuit to file was the eviction notice for Mom and Frank. Despite everything, a small part of me still hesitated. Was I doing the right thing? "You're not leaving them homeless, Elizabeth," Grandma reassured me, sensing my doubt. "They're adults who made their choices. Now it's time for you to make yours." The day of the court hearing arrived all too quickly. I sat in the courtroom, my stomach in knots, as the judge reviewed our case. Mom and Frank sat on the other side, shooting me venomous glares. As the judge began to speak, I held my breath. "In the case of Elizabeth versus Amanda and Frank Thompson, this court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Elizabeth." The relief that washed over me was indescribable. The judge continued, detailing the court's decision: full compensation for moral damages, repayment of all misused funds, return of my college fund, and the eviction of Mom and Frank from my house. I watched as Mom's face contorted with rage. She jumped to her feet, screaming obscenities, while Frank sat stone-faced beside her. As the bailiff escorted them out, Mom's final words rang in my ears. "You ungrateful brat. After everything we've done for you." Those words, once so hurtful, now held no power over me. I knew the truth, and no amount of guilt-tripping could change that. The following weeks were a flurry of activity. Mom and Frank moved out, leaving the house in a state of disarray. It was cathartic, in a way, to clean and reorganize, erasing the traces of their presence from my life. With my newly recovered funds, I was able to enroll in a prestigious college in another city. The day I received my acceptance letter, I cried tears of joy, something I hadn't done in years. As I packed for college, I couldn't help but reflect on the whirlwind of changes in my life. In just a few short months, I'd gone from a neglected, gaslighted teenager to a homeowner and college student with a supportive family. The day of my departure was bittersweet. I hugged Grandma tightly, promising to call often. "Don't worry about the house," she assured me. "I'll keep an eye on things while you're gone." My paternal grandparents drove me to my new campus, helping me move into my dorm room. As we said our goodbyes, my grandfather pressed a small box into my hand. "It was your father's," he explained. "We thought you should have it." Inside was a beautiful watch, engraved with the words, "Time reveals truth." How fitting, I thought, considering recent events. As I settled into college life, I found myself thriving. Free from the constant stress and negativity of my old life, I discovered a passion for learning and a confidence I never knew I possessed. I made new friends, joined clubs, and even started volunteering at a local youth center, hoping to help other kids who might be in situations similar to what I had experienced. Throughout it all, I maintained close contact with both sets of grandparents. Weekend visits home became something I looked forward to, filled with love, laughter, and the warmth of true family. As for Mom and Frank, I heard through the grapevine that they'd moved to another state. Mom had given birth to a baby girl. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy for my half-sister, hoping she wouldn't endure what I had. But I knew it wasn't my responsibility. I had my own life to live now. I'm Audrey, and I've always been the second best in my family. My sister, Sarah, is 5 years older than me and has always been the golden child. From the moment I can remember, everything in our house revolved around her. Sarah got the best of everything, and I got the leftovers. She went to some fancy private school while I was stuck in the local public one. Don't get me wrong, my parents made good money, but apparently not enough for both of us to have nice things. I discovered my love for drawing when I was about 8. I'd spend hours sketching in my room, trying to capture the world around me on paper. When I showed my parents my drawings, hoping they'd be proud, Dad just shrugged. "That's nice, Audrey, but don't waste too much time on it. You need to focus on getting a real job someday. You're not as academically inclined as your sister." Those words stung, but I didn't let them stop me. I started looking up drawing tutorials online, using my allowance to buy cheap art supplies. I'd hide in my room, painting and sketching, dreaming of the day I could show the world my art. Meanwhile, Sarah was the star of the family. Mom and Dad threw money at her like it was going out of style. Dance lessons, acting classes, singing tutors, you name it, Sarah tried it. And gave up on it, usually within a few months. "I'm just not feeling the dance vibe anymore," Sarah announced one day, tossing her ballet shoes in the trash. "I think I want to try photography now." Without missing a beat, Mom said, "Of course, sweetie. We'll get you the best camera and a new laptop for editing. Maybe we can convert the spare room into a darkroom for you." I couldn't believe my ears. Here I was, begging for a few dollars for paintbrushes, while Sarah got an entire room for her latest whim. But that's how it always was in our house. The only person who seemed to see me was Grandma Helen, Mom's mother. She lived nearby in a cozy little house, and visiting her became my escape. One day, she caught me sketching in her garden. Well, she said, peering over my shoulder. "Looks like we've got a regular Picasso here." For the first time, someone looked at my art and saw potential. Grandma Helen's eyes sparkled as she hatched a plan. "How about we set up a little studio for you here? I've got that spare room upstairs that's just collecting dust." Before I knew it, Grandma had transformed that dusty old room into an artist's paradise. She bought me an easel, real artist quality paints, and even signed me up for private lessons with a local artist. As the years rolled by, the gap between Sarah and me only widened. Our living room turned into a shrine to Sarah's so-called achievements. A massive display case dominated the wall, crammed with her certificates, ribbons, and trophies. Most of them were participation awards, but you'd think she'd won Olympic gold the way our parents fawned over them. One day, I timidly approached Mom with a small painting I'd done. It had just won first place in a local art competition. "Hey, Mom? I was wondering if maybe we could put this up somewhere." Mom barely glanced at it. "Oh, that's nice, honey. But where would we put it? The wall's already full of Sarah's things. Maybe you can keep it in your room?" I retreated, clutching my painting. My room became my gallery, walls plastered with artwork that no one but me and Grandma Helen ever saw. When Sarah graduated high school, you'd have thought royalty was going off to college. Mom and Dad spared no expense, sending her to the most prestigious university they could find. They even rented her a luxury apartment near campus. With Sarah gone, you'd think I'd get more attention. Fat chance. Mom and Dad spent hours every day video chatting with her, cooing over her latest adventures. Meanwhile, I was lucky if they remembered I existed at dinner time. Then, like a hurricane, Sarah burst back into our lives. She'd barely graduated when she showed up on our doorstep with a guy in tow. "Mom, Dad," she squealed. "Meet Jake, my husband." Mom and Dad, instead of asking the obvious questions, like, "Oh, I don't know," why they weren't invited to the wedding, just embraced them both. "Oh, sweetie, we're so happy for you," Mom gushed. "Welcome to the family, son." Dad slapped Jake on the back. I stood in the background, invisible as always. Congrats, I guess," I muttered. Sarah barely acknowledged me. "Thanks. Oh, by the way, Jake's going to be living with us for a while." That's cool, right? Before I could process what was happening, Jake was moving his stuff into our guest room. Just like that, our household dynamic shifted again. 2 months flew by in a blur of awkward family dinners and tense silences. Sarah and Jake had taken over the house like a pair of entitled royals, and I was counting down the days until I could escape to college. Then, one evening, Dad called me into the living room. "Audrey, we need to talk." My stomach dropped. Nothing good ever came from those words in this house. Mom and Dad sat on the couch, with Sarah and Jake lounging nearby. I perched on the edge of an armchair, feeling like I was facing a firing squad. Dad cleared his throat. "Audrey, you know we'd been saving for your college fund." I nodded, a glimmer of hope rising in my chest. Maybe they were finally going to do right by me. "Well," he continued, "we'd decided to give that money to Sarah instead." The world stopped. I must have misheard. "What?" Mom jumped in, her voice sickly sweet. "Sweetie, Sarah needs it more. She's married now, starting a family. We have to think about their future." I looked at Sarah, who couldn't even meet my eyes. Jake just smirked. The injustice of it all hit me like a tidal wave. "Are you kidding me? You've given Sarah everything her whole life, and now you're taking away the one thing you promised me? Watch your tone, young lady," Mom snapped. "You should be grateful we're not charging you rent for living here and eating our food all these years." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Grateful? For doing the bare minimum as parents? Dad stood up, his face red. "That's enough. You're an adult now, Audrey, it's time you started acting like one." He disappeared into the hallway and returned with a new suitcase. He dropped it at my feet with a thud that echoed through my soul. "Consider this your graduation gift," he said coldly. "Pack your things and get out, tonight." I looked at each of them in turn, Dad's stern face, Mom's averted eyes, Sarah's guilty expression, Jake's smug grin. Not one of them spoke up for me. In that moment, something inside me broke. And in its place, a steely resolve took root. Without a word, I grabbed the suitcase and marched to my room. As I threw my belongings into it, I could hear Sarah's excited chatter through the wall. "Oh my God, Jake. We can turn Audrey's room into my walk-in closet. I've always wanted one of those." Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. In less than an hour, I had packed up 18 years of my life. I took one last look around the room that had been my sanctuary, my prison. Then, without saying goodbye, I walked out the front door. I stumbled up to Grandma Helen's porch, dragging my suitcase behind me. Before I could even knock, the door flew open, and there she was, arms outstretched. "Oh, Audrey," she said, pulling me into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." I broke down then, ugly sobs racking my body as Grandma held me. She guided me inside, sat me on her worn but comfortable couch, and listened as I poured out the whole sordid tale. When I finished, Grandma's eyes were blazing. "Those fools," she muttered. Then she took my hands in hers. "Audrey, listen to me. You're staying here, and we're going to figure this out together." I slept fitfully that night, but when I came downstairs the next morning, Grandma was at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and her laptop. "Sit down," she said, pushing a mug of coffee towards me. "We're planning your college education, I'm paying for it. Now, let's find you a proper art school." Over the next few weeks, Grandma and I pored over college brochures and websites. We finally settled on a prestigious art school a few hours away. I gathered my best paintings and drawings, carefully photographing each one for my portfolio. I wrote and rewrote my personal essay, pouring my heart onto the page. Grandma helped me collect glowing recommendations from my art teachers. Finally, we sent it all off. The waiting was excruciating, but Grandma kept me busy, encouraging me to paint and even setting up a small exhibition of my work in her garden for the neighbors. Then, on a sunny Tuesday afternoon, the email arrived. I stared at my phone, too nervous to open it. Well, Grandma prompted. With trembling fingers, I tapped the screen. My eyes scanned the first line, and I let out a scream of joy. I got in, I shouted, jumping up and down. Grandma, I got in. From the moment I set foot on campus, I threw myself into every opportunity. I joined the art club, volunteered at gallery openings, and spent countless hours in the studios, honing my craft. My first art competition was terrifying, but when I won third place, the rush was indescribable. I called Grandma immediately, and I could hear the pride in her voice. Just the beginning, she said. Keep going. So I did. I entered more competitions, each one boosting my confidence. I started participating in exhibitions for young artists, seeing my work displayed alongside my peers. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. Professors praised my unique style, classmates asked for collaborations, and I even started selling a few pieces. But it wasn't just about the art. I made friends, real friends who valued me for who I was. I joined study groups, went to parties, and even started dating a fellow artist named Ethan. Late one night, as I was putting the finishing touches on a painting for my midterm project, I realized something. All of this, was what I'd been yearning for my whole life. The freedom to express myself, to grow, to be valued for my talents and my personality. Graduation day arrived in a blur of black gowns and flying mortarboards. I landed a job at a local art gallery, arranging exhibits by day and pouring my soul onto canvas by night. It wasn't glamorous, I was basically a glorified clerk, but it was a foot in the door of the art world. Hey, Audrey, my boss, Frank, called out one day. We've got a spare wall next week. Want to hang some of your stuff? I nearly dropped the sculpture I was carrying. Are you serious? He shrugged. Why not? Your stuff's good. Might as well see if it sells. That little display changed everything. A couple of my paintings sold, then a few more. Soon, I was participating in local exhibitions, my name starting to buzz in art circles. Then came the fantasy series. It started as a fever dream, strange, whimsical creatures dancing across my canvas. I painted them obsessively, creating a whole world of odd, lovable beings. At one exhibition, a man in a sharp suit approached me. Ms. Thompson? I'm from Dreamscape Animations. We're very interested in your work. Before I knew it, I was signing a contract. They wanted to turn my creatures into a cartoon. The day the first episode aired, Grandma and I sat glued to her TV, clutching each other's hands. That's my little Gribble. I squealed as one of my creations waddled across the screen. The show was a hit. Suddenly, everyone wanted a piece of Audrey Thompson's art. The animation studio commissioned a comic series, which I drew with giddy enthusiasm. As my reputation grew, so did the price tags on my paintings. It was surreal, watching collectors bid on my work like it was precious treasure. Frank, my boss at the gallery, pulled me aside one day. Audrey, you're outgrowing us. How about we do a solo exhibition for you? Your own show, your rules. I threw myself into preparation, creating new pieces and carefully selecting from my existing work. The night of the opening, I stood in the gallery, surrounded by my art and a buzzing crowd. Quite a turnout, a familiar voice said. I turned to see Frank, grinning. Listen, kid, you're going places. How about I manage you full-time? We could really take your career to the next level. From that moment, everything accelerated. With Frank's connections and my creativity, we were unstoppable. My paintings hung in prestigious galleries, my name featured in art magazines. Through it all, Grandma Helen was my constant. She came to every exhibition, beaming with pride and offering words of encouragement. Remember when you used to hide your drawings under your bed, she said one night as we celebrated another successful show. Look at you now, setting the art world on fire. I hugged her tight, overwhelmed with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma. You believed in me when no one else did. As we clinked our champagne glasses, I marveled at how far I'd come. From the unwanted second child to a rising star in the art world. But even with all the success, the best part was having Grandma by my side, sharing every triumph and setback. One day I burst into Grandma Helen's kitchen, my mind buzzing with ideas. "Grandma, you won't believe what Frank and I have planned. We're thinking of a cross-country tour, showcasing my work in major cities. And there's talk of an international exhibition in Paris next year." Grandma listened, her eyes twinkling with pride. But as I paused for breath, she reached out and took my hand. "Audrey, darling, I'm so proud of you. You've become such an accomplished young woman. But I think it might be time to consider reconciling with your parents." I wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped me. This was important to her. A week later, I found myself standing on the doorstep of my childhood home, my heart pounding. Mom answered the door, her eyes widening in surprise. "Audrey," she said, her voice uncertain. "What are you doing here?" Dad appeared behind her, his face unreadable. "Well, don't just stand there. Come in, I suppose." The house hadn't changed much, but the atmosphere was heavy, oppressive. They grudgingly allowed me to stay for a few days, but it was clear I wasn't welcome. To my surprise, Sarah was still living at home. "Jake's gone," she said bitterly when I asked. "Mom and Dad kicked him out. Said he was a lazy bum." I bit back a retort about their double standards. This visit wasn't about settling old scores. Days crawled by in uncomfortable silence. Mom and Dad barely spoke to me, their faces constantly pinched with disapproval. I was about ready to call it quits when Sarah cornered me in the kitchen. "So," she said, a familiar mocking tone in her voice, "what are you up to these days? Still doodling?" Something snapped inside me. I straightened up, meeting her gaze. "Actually, I'm one of the most popular and well-paid young artists in the country right now." The kitchen fell silent. I turned to see Mom and Dad frozen in the doorway. Suddenly, their entire demeanor changed. Mom's eyes lit up with a greedy gleam I'd seen directed at Sarah so many times before. "Oh, Audrey," she cooed, trying to take my arm. "Why didn't you tell us? We've been so worried about you." I jerked away from her touch. "I was just leaving, actually." No, Dad interjected. "Stay. Tell us more about your work. How much do your paintings sell for?" I shook my head. "That's confidential information." His face hardened. "Now listen here, young lady. We're your parents. We have a right to know. After all we've done for you, you owe us." And there it was. The true colors I knew had been there all along. "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly. "You kicked me out, remember? You chose Sarah over me at every turn. And now that I'm successful, you want a piece of it?" "No, I'm done." I brushed past them, ignoring their protests and demands. I threw my things into my bag and walked out the door, their angry voices fading behind me. When I told Grandma what happened, she smiled sadly. "Oh, Audrey, I'm sorry it went that way. But I'm proud of you for trying." As I drove home that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I'd given them a chance, more than they deserved. Now I could move forward, guilt-free, focusing on the people who truly cared about me and the art that had saved me. That call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Grandma Helen was in the hospital. I dropped everything and rushed to her side, my heart in my throat. For weeks, I barely left her room. I held her hand, told her stories, and tried to repay a fraction of the love and support she'd given me over the years. But in the end, she was gone. I threw myself into organizing the funeral, grateful for the distraction from my grief. It was a beautiful service, filled with people whose lives Grandma Helen had touched. I stood alone by her grave long after everyone else had left, feeling more lost than I had in years. 2 weeks later, I received a call from a notary. "Ms. Thompson, we need to discuss your grandmother's will." I sat in the sterile office, numb, as the lawyer read out the details. And to my beloved granddaughter, Audrey Thompson, I leave all my worldly possessions, including my house and savings. I couldn't believe it. Grandma Helen had left me everything. I was just starting to find my footing again when Sarah showed up on my doorstep. "Audrey," she said, her eyes red-rimmed. "I need your help. I'm pregnant. I left Mom and Dad, I couldn't take their nagging anymore. But now I have nowhere to go, no money." I listened, a mix of pity and suspicion churning in my gut. "Sarah, I'm sorry you're in this situation, but what do you expect me to do?" "Give me my share," she demanded. "I need Grandma's money." I shook my head. "There is no your share, Sarah. Grandma left everything to me." Her face contorted with rage. "That's not fair. You must have tricked her, you thief. I'll take you to court, you'll see." I slammed the door, my hands shaking. But it wasn't over. The next day, Mom called. "Audrey, be reasonable," she wheedled. "Your sister needs help. We're family, you owe us." "I don't owe you anything," I replied, my voice ice cold. "You kicked me out, remember? Where was your sense of family then?" I hung up. But they weren't done. Suddenly, my social media was flooded with accusations. Posts from my parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all claiming I'd manipulated Grandma Helen, that I was a thief who'd stolen their rightful inheritance. Then came the rumors of a lawsuit. Apparently, Sarah and my parents had gone to a lawyer, convinced they could challenge the will. But as quickly as the rumors started, they died down. The law was clear, Grandma Helen's will was ironclad. Through it all, I clung to Grandma's last words to me. "Be strong. Keep painting your dreams." And that's exactly what I did. I poured my pain and anger into my art, creating some of my most powerful pieces yet. 2 years flew by in a whirlwind of color and creativity. My paintings hung in prestigious galleries across the country, my name was featured in art magazines, and I even did a few TV interviews. It was surreal, seeing my face on the screen, talking about my journey and my art. But even as I reveled in my success, a shadow lurked at the edges of my life. Despite their failed attempts to challenge Grandma's will, my parents and Sarah hadn't given up their campaign of harassment. I'd learned to ignore it, to focus on my art and the positive relationships in my life. Then came the night of my biggest exhibition yet. The gallery was packed, the atmosphere electric. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by my latest works, feeling on top of the world. "Audrey, darling, this is your best show yet," Frank gushed, clapping me on the back. That's when I saw them. Mom and Dad, pushing through the crowd, their faces twisted with rage. Before I could react, Mom had uncapped a can of paint and flung it at my centerpiece. "Thief," Dad bellowed as the red paint dripped down the protective glass. "She stole our money." The room erupted into chaos. Security guards rushed in, wrestling my parents towards the exit. Guests whispered and pointed, their shocked faces illuminated by camera flashes. I stood frozen, my heart pounding. This was supposed to be my moment of triumph, and they'd turned it into a circus. As the guards escorted my parents out, Mom's shrill voice echoed through the gallery. "She tricked her grandmother. That money should have been ours." The exhibition was effectively over. Even though the paintings were undamaged, thanks to their protective coverings, the mood was shattered. As I watched the last guests trickle out, something inside me hardened. Enough was enough. The next morning, I marched into a lawyer's office. "I want a restraining order," I said, my voice steady. "And I want to sue for defamation." I laid out everything, the social media harassment, the threatening messages, the scene at the gallery. The lawyer listened, his expression grave. "We have a strong case," he assured me. "They've gone too far." The legal process was grueling, but I stood my ground. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. My parents and Sarah were legally barred from contacting me, or coming near me or my property. The defamation suit was settled out of court, with a public retraction of their claims. As I left the courthouse, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I could breathe freely. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my work with renewed passion. I traveled the world, finding inspiration in bustling cities and quiet villages alike. My exhibitions became events, celebrated in the art world and beyond. But more than the fame or the money, I found joy in giving back. I started a program offering free art classes to kids from low-income families, remembering how art had been my lifeline. Years have passed since that day in court. I haven't spoken to my parents or Sarah since, and I don't intend to. Some bridges, once burned, are better left in ashes. But I'm not bitter. I'm grateful. Grateful for Grandma Helen, who believed in me when no one else did. Grateful for the struggles that shaped me and the triumphs that followed.
I'm Meryl, and I grew up in what you'd call an ordinary family. Mom and Dad were hardworking folks, trying their best to raise 2 girls. That's right, I had a younger sister, Sarah. She came into this world 5 years after me, and boy, did she shake things up. From the get-go, I was the good kid. Studied hard, got along with everyone, never caused trouble. Sarah? She was a whole different story. I remember this one time when I was 10 and Sarah was 5. We were at the grocery store with Mom and Sarah wanted some candy. "No, Sarah," Mom said firmly. "We've got plenty of snacks at home." Sarah's face turned red. "But I want it now," she screamed, throwing herself on the floor. People started staring. Mom looked embarrassed, trying to calm Sarah down. But Sarah wouldn't budge. She kicked and screamed louder, "I hate you. You never let me have anything." That was just one of many incidents. As we grew older, things didn't get better. Sarah's behavior became more erratic. She'd have these intense mood swings, going from laughing to screaming in seconds. One day, Mom and Dad took Sarah to a psychologist. When they came back, I could tell something was up. They sat me down in the living room, looking all serious. "Meryl," Dad started, "we need to talk to you about Sarah." Mom chimed in. "The doctor says Sarah has something called a DHD. It means her brain works a bit differently." I nodded, not really understanding. "Is that why she acts out all the time?" "Yes, sweetie," Mom said. "And we need your help. We have to be extra patient with Sarah now." Little did I know that conversation would set the tone for the next decade of my life. Everything became about Sarah, her needs, her moods, her outbursts. And me, I was expected to be the understanding older sister, always patient, always forgiving. But let me tell you, it wasn't easy. As Sarah's behavior got worse, my parents' attention shifted more and more towards her. They were so afraid of upsetting her that they started giving in to her every whim. Meanwhile, I was left to fend for myself. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't neglected. But compared to the constant attention Sarah got, it felt like I was invisible sometimes. As the years went by, Sarah's behavior became a roller coaster ride. One week, she'd be almost normal, helping with chores, doing her homework, even being nice to me. But it never lasted. I remember one afternoon when I was 16. I came home from school to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, actually doing her math homework. "Hey Sarah," I said, surprised. "How's it going?" She looked up and smiled. "Pretty good. I think I'm finally getting this algebra stuff." For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were finally turning around. But a week later, that hope was shattered. I was in my room studying when I heard a crash downstairs. Sarah was screaming at Mom. "I don't care about stupid school. You can't make me go." Then came the sound of breaking glass. I sighed and put my headphones on. Just another day in our house. When I turned 17, things got even worse. I was trying to prepare for college applications, but Sarah seemed determined to make it impossible. One evening I was at my desk, deep in a practice SAT test. Suddenly, ear-splitting music blasted through the walls. I stormed into Sarah's room. "Can you turn that down? I'm trying to study." "Boo-hoo," she mocked. "Poor Meryl needs to study." "Well, I need to listen to music. Deal with it." I went to our parents, hoping they'd intervene. but their response left me speechless. "Honey," Mom said, "you know your sister has trouble controlling herself. Try to be understanding." Dad nodded. "Maybe you could study at the library? We don't want to upset Sarah." I couldn't believe it. "But what about me? Don't my needs matter?" Mom patted my hand. "Of course they do, sweetie. But Sarah's condition makes things difficult for her. We all need to make allowances." I went back to my room, fuming. It was always about Sarah, always. A few weeks later, Sarah dropped a bombshell at dinner. "I want to go live with Grandma," she announced. Mom and Dad exchanged worried looks. "Are you sure?" Honey, Mom asked. "That's a big change." Sarah nodded. "Grandma said I could come anytime. She'll let me do whatever I want." I held my breath, hardly daring to hope. To my surprise, my parents agreed. Maybe a change of scenery would be good for everyone, Dad said. As Sarah packed her bags, she cornered me in the hallway. "Don't think you're getting rid of me," she hissed. "Grandma's loaded, you know. She'll spoil me rotten and leave me everything in her will. You'll be working your ass off in college while I'm set for life." I just rolled my eyes. "Whatever, Sarah. Just go." For the next 6 months, our house was peaceful. I could finally focus on my studies without constant interruptions. I aced my SATs and got accepted into a public college in another city. I'd been in college for a few months when I got the call. It was Mom, and she sounded exhausted. "It's Sarah, she's back home. Your grandmother, she couldn't handle Sarah anymore. Said she was too disobedient, always causing trouble. She even blamed us for bad parenting. Now she won't talk to any of us." I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of frustration and pity. "I'm sorry, Mom. That must be tough." "It is," she admitted. "We're trying everything. Taking her to a new psychologist, giving her whatever she wants. We're hoping it'll help." Then came the kicker. "Meryl, sweetie, about your college expenses, we can't help you anymore. All our money is going towards Sarah's treatment and, well, her demands. You'll need to support yourself from now on." After we hung up, I just sat there trying to process it all. Once again, Sarah had managed to upend my life without even being present. But I wasn't about to let this derail me. I found a part-time job at a local diner and called my grandmother. "Of course I'll help you," dear Grandma said when I explained the situation. "It's the least I can do after everything you've been through." True to her word, Grandma started sending me money for rent and even visited me a few times. During one of her visits, we had a heart-to-heart. "You know, Meryl," she said, sipping her tea, "I feel guilty about Sarah. I thought I could handle her, but still I'm glad I can help you. You deserve it, sweetheart." Those years in college were tough, but also liberating. For the first time, I was free from Sarah's shadow. I made friends, studied hard, and even started dating a bit. After graduation, I landed a job in the same city and decided to stay. It felt good to have my own life, away from the chaos at home. I did visit my parents occasionally, but Sarah was never around. One time I asked Mom about her. "Oh, she's out with friends," Mom said, wringing her hands. "She's been gone for days now. We can barely keep track of her anymore." Dad chimed in, always with different boys too. "There's Jake, or was it John? And then there's that Mike fellow." I raised an eyebrow. "And you're okay with this?" Mom shrugged helplessly. "What can we do? It's just how she is. The psychologist says it's part of her condition." I bit my tongue to keep from saying what I really thought. It was always excuses with them when it came to Sarah. During another visit, I found Mom crying in the kitchen. "What's wrong?" I asked, alarmed. She wiped her eyes. "It's Sarah. She's been gone for 2 weeks this time. We don't know where she is or who she's with." I felt a pang of worry, despite everything. "Have you called the police?" Dad shook his head. "We did once before. She came back on her own and was furious with us for reporting her missing. Said we were trying to control her life." I left that day feeling frustrated and sad. It was clear that nothing had changed. Sarah was still the center of their world, no matter how badly she behaved. As I drove back to my apartment, I couldn't help but feel grateful for the life I'd built for myself. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Time flies when you're building your own life. Before I knew it, 3 years had passed since I'd graduated college. I was settling into my career, making new friends, and finally feeling like I had some stability. Then came the phone call that threw me for a loop. "Meryl? It's Mom. You'll never guess what's happened. Sarah's getting married." I nearly dropped the phone. "Married? Sarah?" Mom's voice was brimming with excitement. "Yes, can you believe it? She just told us. The wedding's in 2 months. You'll come, won't you?" Still in shock, I agreed. The day of the wedding arrived, and I flew back home. As I helped Sarah get ready, she dropped another bombshell. "Mom and Dad are paying for our honeymoon," she said smugly. 2 weeks in Bali. First class all the way. I bit my tongue. Of course they were. "That's nice of them," I managed. Sarah smirked. "Well, they owe me. After all the crap I've been through." I wanted to point out that most of that crap was of her own making, but I held back. It was her wedding day, after all. When I finally met Sarah's fiancé, Mark, I was taken aback. He was nothing like I'd imagined. Tall, handsome, and at least 10 years older than Sarah, he exuded an air of calm confidence. "It's great to finally meet you, Meryl," he said, shaking my hand. "Sarah's told me so much about you." I raised an eyebrow at Sarah, wondering what exactly she'd told him. To my surprise, the wedding went off without a hitch. Sarah looked radiant, and for once, she seemed genuinely happy. As I watched them exchange vows, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this really would be the turning point for her. At the reception, Mom cornered me by the punch bowl. "Isn't this wonderful, Meryl?" she gushed. "Sarah's really landed on her feet. Mark's so successful, and he clearly adores her." I nodded, sipping my drink. "It's great, Mom. I'm happy for her." Then came the kicker. "You know, sweetie, maybe it's time you started thinking about settling down too. You're not getting any younger." I nearly choked on my punch. "Mom, I'm only 26. She patted my arm. "I know, dear. But look at Sarah. She's really got it all figured out now." As I flew back to my city the next day, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Despite everything, I genuinely hoped Sarah had found happiness. But a small part of me wondered how long it would last. Life went on. I threw myself into work, trying not to dwell on my family's dynamics. Then, about a year after Sarah's wedding, something unexpected happened. I met someone. His name was Tom, and we hit it off immediately. He was kind, funny, and actually listened when I talked. For the first time, I felt like I'd found someone who saw me for who I really was. 2 years flew by in a whirlwind of dates, laughter, and deepening love. Then, on a crisp autumn evening, Tom got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. As I said yes, tears of joy streaming down my face, I felt like my life was finally falling into place. Planning my wedding to Tom was like a dream. For once, I was the center of attention, and it felt amazing. I was determined to make it perfect, a day that was all about us and our love. Of course, I invited my family. Despite everything, they were still my parents, and Sarah was still my sister. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, this happy occasion would bring us all together. When Sarah showed up at the venue, she was alone. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "Where's Mark?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. Sarah shrugged. "Couldn't make it." "Is everything okay?" I pressed. "It's fine," she snapped. "Can we drop it?" I backed off, not wanting to start an argument on my wedding day. But later, I overheard Mom and Dad talking in hushed tones. "I'm worried about Sarah and Mark," Mom was saying. "They're fighting all the time now. But it's not her fault, she's just high-spirited. Mark needs to be more understanding." I walked away, shaking my head. Some things never change. The ceremony was beautiful, everything I'd dreamed of. Tom's eyes shone with love as we said our vows, and for a while I forgot all about the family drama. But at the reception, Sarah made sure she couldn't be ignored. She got drunk, loudly flirted with Tom's friends, and even tried to give a speech that quickly devolved into a rant about how unfair her life had been. I gritted my teeth and plastered on a smile, determined not to let her ruin my day. Tom, bless him, stuck by my side, squeezing my hand supportively. As Sarah was dragged off the dance floor by our embarrassed parents, I made a silent vow to myself. This was the last time I'd let her drama overshadow my life. For a while, it seemed like I might actually keep that vow. Tom and I settled into married life, and I heard little from my family beyond the occasional phone call. Then, almost exactly a year after our wedding, my phone rang. It was Mom, and she was crying. "Meryl, it's Sarah. Mark left her." Between sobs, Mom explained. Mark had found out about Sarah's multiple affairs and filed for divorce. She was devastated, they said, acting out worse than ever. "We don't know what to do," Mom wailed. "The psychologist says she needs a change of scenery, some time away to heal." I knew what was coming before she said it. "Honey, we were hoping. Could Sarah stay with you for a while? Remember how we sent her to your grandmother's so you could study for your exams? We need your help now." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of family obligations settling on my shoulders. "Let me talk to Tom," I said finally. After I hung up, I sat Tom down and explained the situation. He listened patiently, his brow furrowed with concern, but finally agreed. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday, looking like a shadow of her former self. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and she barely spoke above a whisper. For the first time in years, I felt a genuine pang of sympathy for my little sister. "Come on," I said gently, leading her to the guest room. "Let's get you settled in." Tom was amazing those first few days. He cooked Sarah's favorite meals, engaged her in light conversation, and even took a day off work to help us go shopping for some new clothes to cheer her up. But as the saying goes, no good deed goes unpunished. About a week into Sarah's stay, I started noticing changes. Small things at first, a lingering look here, an accidental brush against Tom there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination running wild. Then one day I came home from work to find Sarah parading around the living room in what could barely be called underwear. Tom was sitting on the couch, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "Sarah," I exclaimed. "What are you doing?" She turned, feigning innocence. "Oh, hi Meryl, I was just about to take a shower. It's so hot today, isn't it, Tom?" Tom mumbled something incoherent and practically ran from the room. That night, I confronted Sarah. "Look, I know you're going through a tough time, but you need to respect our home and our marriage." She rolled her eyes. "God, Meryl, don't be such a prude. I was just trying to cool off." I didn't buy it for a second, but I let it go. Big mistake. Over the next few days, Sarah's behavior became more and more brazen. She'd accidentally walk in on Tom in the bathroom, or bend over suggestively when he was around. I was at my wit's end. Then came the day that broke the camel's back. I came home early from work, a migraine pounding behind my eyes. As I approached our apartment, I heard Sarah's voice, loud and clear. "Come on, Tom, Meryl never has to know. Don't you want to have some real fun for once?" I burst through the door to find Sarah pressed up against my husband, her hands on his chest. Tom looked horrified. "Meryl," he exclaimed, pushing Sarah away. "This isn't what it looks like." Sarah spun around, a look of faux shock on her face. "Oh my God, Meryl, I'm so embarrassed. I just tripped and Tom caught me." I saw red. "Get out," I said, my voice dangerously low. "Pack your things and get the hell out of my house. Now." Sarah's face contorted with rage. "Fine, I never wanted to stay in this dump anyway. You're pathetic, Meryl. Always so boring, so frigid." She turned to Tom, who was standing there in shock. "You could do so much better than her, you know. A hot piece like me instead of Ice Queen Meryl." I grabbed her arm and dragged her to the guest room. "You have 5 minutes to pack, or I'm throwing your stuff out the window." As Sarah scrambled to gather her things, hurling insults the whole time, I turned to Tom. He looked devastated. Meryl, I swear nothing happened. She's been trying for days, but I would never. I cut him off with a hug. I know. I trust you. I'm so sorry I put you through this. We held each other as we listened to Sarah's continued tirade. Finally, she emerged from the room, suitcase in hand. You'll regret this, she spat. Both of you. As the door slammed behind her, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. As we stood there in our now quiet apartment, I realized something. The family I'd spent my whole life trying to please, trying to fix, they weren't my real family anymore. Tom was. And it was time I started putting our life, our marriage, first. I hadn't even finished my first cup of coffee the next morning when my phone rang. It was Mom. I braced myself and answered. How could you, Meryl? Mom's voice was shrill with anger. Kicking your own sister out onto the street. I thought we raised you better than that. I took a deep breath. Mom, it's not what you think. But she cut me off. Sarah told us everything. How you got jealous because she and Tom were getting along. How you made up lies about her to justify throwing her out. I'm so disappointed in you. My jaw dropped. What? Mom, that's not true at all. Sarah tried to seduce Tom. She was walking around half naked, throwing herself at him. She even propositioned him. There was a pause. Then Dad's voice came on the line. Now, Meryl, don't you think you're exaggerating a bit? We know Sarah has her issues, but she's family, and family supports each other, no matter what. Something inside me snapped. Years of pent-up frustration and resentment came pouring out. Support? Where was your support when I was trying to study for college and Sarah was making my life hell? Where was your support when you cut me off financially because you were too busy catering to Sarah's every whim? I've spent my entire life trying to understand and make allowances for Sarah. And I'm done. I'm done being the responsible one, the one who always has to sacrifice. You raised her to be this way, and now you can deal with the consequences. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Dad spoke, his voice cold. If that's how you feel, maybe it's best we don't speak for a while. And don't be surprised if the rest of the family feels the same way once they hear about this. I laughed bitterly. Is that supposed to be a threat? Go ahead. Tell them whatever version of the story makes you feel better about your parenting failures. I hung up. True to my parents' word, the calls started coming in. Aunts, uncles, cousins, all of them expressing their shock and disappointment in my cruel treatment of Sarah. How could you abandon your sister in her time of need? My Aunt Linda scolded. I always knew you were jealous of Sarah, but this is a new low. Cousin Mike messaged me. I tried explaining the truth to the first few, but it quickly became clear that their minds were made up. Sarah and my parents had spun a tale of my jealousy and cruelty, and the family had lapped it up. The final straw came when I logged onto Facebook. There, in black and white, was a post from Sarah. Heartbroken. My own sister threw me out when I needed her most. I guess blood isn't always thicker than water. Family drama betrayed. The comments were a cesspool of family members and old acquaintances expressing their sympathy for Sarah and their disgust with me. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I could respond, tell my side of the story. But what was the point? They'd already made up their minds. With a heavy heart, I began blocking numbers and unfriending relatives on social media. It hurt, cutting ties with people I'd known my whole life. But as I looked over at Tom, who had stayed by my side through all of this, I knew I was making the right choice. In the weeks that followed the fallout with my family, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The pain of being ostracized by my own relatives was raw and ever-present. But amidst the darkness, there was one beacon of light: my grandmother. Meryl, dear, she said during one of our weekly phone calls, I want you to know that I believe you. I know Sarah, and I know you. You did the right thing. Tears welled up in my eyes. Thanks, Grandma. You don't know how much that means to me. She chuckled softly. Oh, I think I do. Now tell me about your week. How's that wonderful husband of yours? And just like that, life went on. Tom and I settled into a peaceful routine, free from the drama that had plagued us for so long. We traveled, pursued our careers, and even started talking about starting a family of our own. Months passed, then a year. I heard snippets about my family through the grapevine. Sarah had moved back in with our parents, apparently unable to support herself after the divorce. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on my own life. Then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, my phone rang. It was a number I hadn't seen in over a year, my parents. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello." "Meryl," it was my mother, her voice choked with tears. "Meryl, we need your help." A familiar weight settled in my stomach. "What's wrong?" Between sobs, she explained. Sarah had spiraled out of control. She was bringing strange men home, throwing wild parties, and had even physically threatened our parents when they tried to intervene. "She kicked us out." Meryl, Dad's voice came on the line. "We're staying at a motel, we don't know what to do. Can you come talk to her? Maybe she'll listen to you?" I closed my eyes, feeling a mix of emotions wash over me, anger, pity, frustration, but mostly I felt nothing. "No," I said quietly. "I can't." "But Meryl," Mom started. I cut her off. "No, Mom, I'm done. I've spent my entire life cleaning up Sarah's messes, making excuses for her behavior, and when I finally stood up for myself, you all turned your backs on me. This is your problem now. You raised her, you enabled her. Now you have to deal with the consequences." Before they could respond, I hung up. Then, with a sense of finality, I blocked their numbers. Tom found me on the couch a little while later, staring into space. "Everything okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. I looked up at him and smiled. Really smiled. "You know what? It is. For the first time in my life, I think everything is actually okay." As we sat there, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Yes, I had lost the family I was born into. But I had gained so much more. I had Tom, my rock and my partner. I had my grandmother, who loved me unconditionally. And most importantly, I had myself stronger and more self-assured than ever before. The next day, I called my grandmother. "Hey, Grandma, how would you like to come visit for a while? Tom and I were thinking of redecorating the guest room, and we could use your expert eye." Her joy was palpable through the phone. "Oh, Meryl, I'd love to. When should I come?" As I hung up, making plans for my grandmother's visit, I realized something. This was what family should be. People who support you, love you, and bring joy to your life. I'm Natalie, 27 years old, and I'm getting married in a few weeks. Right now, I'm sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by a sea of wedding invitations. My eyes scan the names, making sure I haven't forgotten anyone important. But there's one name I deliberately left off the list: my stepmother's. I know what you're thinking. How could I not invite my stepmother to my own wedding? Well, it's a long story, and I guess now's as good a time as any to tell it. It all started when I was 5 years old. My parents split up, and my whole world turned upside down. They told me I'd be living with both of them, switching back and forth. At the time, I thought it was great. I loved both my parents and couldn't choose between them. This way, I didn't have to. Life after the divorce wasn't so bad at first. When I was with my dad, we'd go on these amazing road trips. He owned his own business, so he could take time off whenever it was his turn to have me. We'd hop in his car and explore different cities. I remember feeling like a little explorer, discovering new places with my dad by my side. When I was with my mom, things were different but just as good. We'd spend hours playing with my dolls, making up stories for each one, and the smell of fresh-baked cookies often filled the house. Those were happy times. I felt loved, wanted, and cherished by both my parents. But then, things changed. My dad got remarried when I was 7. I remember the day he introduced me to Sarah, my soon-to-be stepmother. She was pretty, with long blonde hair and a smile that seemed to light up the room. At first, things were okay. Sarah was nice to me, and she seemed to genuinely care. She'd help me with my homework when I was at Dad's house and even taught me how to braid my hair. But as time went on, something shifted. Sarah wanted kids of her own, but she couldn't get pregnant. I didn't understand it at the time, but looking back now, I can see how it affected her. Sarah's attitude towards me did a complete 180. Where once she'd been kind and welcoming, now she seemed to resent my very existence. It was like she hated me for being born when she couldn't have children of her own. I didn't understand it then. I was just a kid, wondering what I'd done wrong to make my stepmother suddenly dislike me so much. As time went on, Sarah's attitude towards me only got worse. It was like she'd made a decision if she couldn't have kids of her own, she'd live for herself. And in that life there was no room for me. I started noticing changes when I'd come back from my mom's. Dad and Sarah would be tanned and relaxed, full of stories about trips they'd taken while I was gone. One day, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Dad, why don't we go on trips like we used to?" He looked uncomfortable, glancing at Sarah before answering. "Well, sweetie, things are different now. We have to consider Sarah's schedule too." Sarah cut in, her voice sharp. "Natalie, you're old enough to understand that adults need their own time. Don't be selfish." I felt like I'd been slapped. Selfish? For wanting to spend time with my own father? But it wasn't just the trips. When I was at Dad's house, everything changed. Sarah had new rules for me, and they all seemed designed to keep me out of sight and out of mind. "Natalie," she'd say, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "why don't you go play in your room? Adults are talking." At first I tried to argue, "But I want to be out here with you and Dad." Sarah's eyes would narrow. "Your father and I need some peace and quiet. Is that too much to ask?" So I'd retreat to my room, feeling more like a prisoner than a daughter in my own father's house. The list of Don Ts grew longer by the day. Don't make noise. Don't talk loudly. Don't play active games. Don't laugh too loud. It was like living in a library, but worse. One afternoon I was in the living room, laughing at a funny TV show. Sarah stormed in, face red with anger. "What did I tell you about being quiet?" she snapped. "But I was just laughing at." She cut me off. "I don't care what you were laughing at. In this house you follow my rules. Understand?" I nodded, fighting back tears. "Yes, Sarah." "Good," she said, turning to leave. "Now go to your room and stay there until dinner." Dad seemed oblivious to it all. Or maybe he just didn't want to see it. Whenever I tried to talk to him about how Sarah was treating me, he'd brush it off. "She's just adjusting, Natalie," he'd say. "Give her time." But time didn't make things better. It only made Sarah more bold in her dislike of me. She'd criticize everything I did, from how I dressed to how I ate. "Honestly, Natalie, can't you sit up straight and chew with your mouth closed? It's like you were raised in a barn." I wanted to scream, to tell her that I was just a kid, that I was trying my best, but I knew it wouldn't make a difference. In Sarah's eyes, my very existence was an offense. So I learned to make myself small, to be quiet, to stay out of the way. I became a ghost in my father's house, tiptoeing around, afraid to make a sound or draw attention to myself. Every 2 weeks, when it was time to go back to Mom's, I felt like I could breathe again. But the dread of returning to Dad's house, to Sarah's cold stares and harsh words, always loomed over me. I managed to keep my emotions bottled up for years, but by the time I turned 12, I couldn't take it anymore. One day, after a particularly nasty encounter with Sarah, I broke down and told Mom everything. Mom listened, her face growing darker with each word. When I finished, she exploded. "That thing," she yelled, making me jump. "How dare she treat my daughter like this?" Before I could stop her, Mom was on the phone with Dad. I've never heard her so angry. "Listen here, you spineless excuse for a father," she snarled into the phone. "If you don't get your wife under control, I swear I'll take you to court and make sure you never see Natalie again." I felt sick. This wasn't what I wanted. I just wanted things to get better, not worse. A few days later, when I went back to Dad's house, he sat me down for a serious talk. "Natalie," he began, his voice stern. "We need to discuss your behavior. Sarah has been nothing but good to you. She's trying her best to be a good stepmother, and all you do is complain." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "But Dad, she..." "Enough," he snapped. "Do you realize what you've done? Your mother is threatening to take away my visitation rights. Do you want that? Do you want to never see me again?" Tears welled up in my eyes. "No, of course not." Dad's voice softened a bit. "Then you need to stop this, Natalie. No more complaints about Sarah. She only wants what's best for you. If you keep this up, you'll end up tearing this family apart. Is that what you want?" I shook my head, unable to speak through my tears. As he left the room, I felt like my world had shattered. Not only had Dad not believed me, but he'd also made me feel like everything was my fault. I was the problem, not Sarah. From that day on, I stopped complaining. I decided to be the perfect stepdaughter, to do everything Sarah wanted, just so I wouldn't lose my dad. I became a shadow in the house, quiet and obedient. I had no say in anything, but at least I still got to see my father, even if he seemed more like a stranger with each passing day. Life at Mom's house was a different story. A few years after the divorce from Dad, Mom met Robert. He was kind, funny, and had a daughter of his own, Lily, who was a year younger than me. Over time, I fell in love with both of them. Robert never tried to replace my dad, but he was always there for me. He'd help me with my homework, listen to my problems, and even taught me how to ride a bike, something Dad had always been too busy to do. Lily became the sister I never knew I wanted. We'd stay up late, giggling and sharing secrets. She never made me feel like an outsider. As I got older, the contrast between my two homes became starker. At Dad's, I was a ghost, trying not to upset the delicate balance. At Mom's, I was Natalie, loud, funny, and loved. As I entered my teenage years, my needs naturally grew. Like any kid my age, I wanted the latest gadgets, a cool smartphone, a decent laptop for schoolwork. Dad, to his credit, seemed to understand this. He'd always been generous, and at first he didn't hesitate to buy me what I needed. I remember the day he handed me my first smartphone. But my joy was short-lived. Sarah's disapproving frown said it all. Later that night, I overheard them arguing. "You're spoiling her," Tom Sarah hissed. "Do you have any idea how much that phone cost?" "She needs it for school," Dad defended weakly. Sarah scoffed. "Please. She needs it to post selfies and waste time on social media. You're throwing money away." From that day on, Sarah appointed herself as the family's financial guardian. She told Dad she'd help him save money when it came to my expenses. What this really meant was that she'd take control of everything I got. The next time I needed new clothes, Sarah insisted on handling it herself. What followed was a parade of secondhand clothes and shoes, all bought from discount websites or clearance sales. Don't get me wrong, I'm not against secondhand stuff, but Sarah took it to an extreme. More often than not, the clothes were ill-fitting, out of style, or just plain uncomfortable. But I didn't dare complain. I still remembered Dad's warning about tearing the family apart. The irony of it all, while I was forced to wear hand-me-downs, Sarah never skimped on herself. Her closet was a fashion magazine, come-to-life designer shoes, branded bags, clothes from the latest collections. She'd spend hours preening in front of the mirror, adjusting her perfectly coordinated outfits. Things came to a head when I graduated high school. Dad had promised me a car, nothing fancy, just something to get me around. I was over the moon. Finally, a sign that he still cared, that he saw me as more than just an inconvenience in his new life. But Sarah, true to form, couldn't let it happen. The night before we were supposed to go car shopping, all hell broke loose. "A car?" Sarah shrieked. "Are you out of your mind, Tom? We can't afford it. Besides, I need a new car. Mine is almost 3 years old." I listened from my room, heart sinking with every word. I knew how this would end. Sure enough, the next morning, Dad came to me with that look on his face, the one that said he was about to disappoint me again. "Natalie, honey," he began, not meeting my eyes. "About the car." I saved him the trouble. "It's okay, Dad. I understand. We can't afford it, right?" He looked relieved that he didn't have to say it himself.
Right.
"But hey, I promise I'll pay for any college you want to go to, and your accommodation too. How's that sound?" I forced a smile. "Sounds great, Dad. Thanks." As he left my room, I heard Sarah's voice from downstairs. "Tom, dear, when are we going to look at that new Jeep I wanted?" so I sat there, in my room full of ill-fitting clothes, clutching my outdated phone, dreaming of a car I'd never get. And I realized something: the material things weren't what hurt the most. It was what they represented. Every second-hand shirt, every denied request, every broken promise was just another way of saying, "You're not worth it, Natalie." When it came time to choose a college, I poured my heart into researching the best options. I finally found one that seemed perfect: great program, beautiful campus, and not too far from home. I was ecstatic when I got accepted. But as soon as Sarah saw the tuition fees, all hell broke loose. "Are you kidding me?" she screeched, face turning red. "This is highway robbery." Dad tried to calm her down. "Now, Sarah, we did promise Natalie." "I don't care what we promised," Sarah interrupted, practically foaming at the mouth. "We are not paying this much for her to party for 4 years. She stormed off and returned with a handful of brochures. Here she thrust them at Dad. "These colleges are much more reasonable, and they're farther away. It'll teach her some independence." And just like that, my dreams were crushed again. I ended up at Sarah's choice of college: cheaper, yes, but also far from everything and everyone I knew. Mom and Robert were thrilled when they heard I was going to college. They didn't know about the behind-the-scenes drama, and I didn't have the heart to tell them. Why burden them with my problems? Despite everything, I threw myself into my studies. I was determined to make the most of this opportunity, even if it wasn't exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd come home for holidays, splitting my time between Mom's welcoming house and Dad's. Well, Dad's house. It was during one of these breaks that everything finally came to a head. Sarah was having a birthday party, and to my surprise, Dad called and asked me to come. "Sarah would love to see you," he said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. I was skeptical, but a small part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. So I agreed. I even bought Sarah a gift, a nice scarf I'd saved up for from my part-time job at college. When I arrived at the house, the party was in full swing. I took a deep breath and approached Sarah, gift in hand. "Happy birthday, Sarah," I said, forcing a smile. "I hope you like." I never got to finish. Sarah's face contorted with rage. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. I stammered, confused. "But Dad said you wanted me to come." "Get out," she shrieked. "You're not welcome here. How dare you show up and ruin my party?" I stood there, frozen in shock. The room had gone silent, all eyes on us. Sarah snatched the gift from my hands and, without even looking at it, tossed it in a nearby trash can. "I don't want anything from you. You're not worthy to be here among my friends. Leave. Now." Tears stung my eyes as I turned and fled. I ran up to my old room, grabbing the few belongings I'd left there over the years. As I reached for the front door, I heard Sarah's laughter floating from the living room, as if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't just publicly humiliated her stepdaughter and thrown away a heartfelt gift. I slammed the door behind me and walked away from that house for what I promised myself would be the last time. I went straight to Mom's, where I broke down and finally told her everything: all the years of mistreatment, the manipulation, the broken promises. Mom was furious, but more than that, she was heartbroken for me. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, holding me close. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry you went through all that alone." As I cried in my mother's arms, I felt a weird mix of sadness and relief. Sad for the relationship with my father that I'd probably never have, but relieved to finally be free from Sarah's toxic presence. The day after Sarah's birthday disaster, my phone rang. It was Dad. I almost didn't answer, but a part of me still hoped he'd apologize, that he'd finally see the truth. "Natalie," he said, his voice stern, "why did you leave Sarah's party so abruptly? She was quite upset." My blood boiled. "That's not what happened. She yelled at me in front of everyone and threw my gift in the trash. She kicked me out." There was a pause, then Dad's voice came back, cold and angry. "I can't believe you'd make up such lies about Sarah. Why are you trying to denigrate my wife? Call me when you're ready to apologize to Sarah." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, tears streaming down my face. That was the moment I realized I'd truly lost my father. The next few years were a blur. I threw myself into my studies, graduated college with honors, and landed a decent job. I saw Dad a handful of times, always on neutral ground: a cafe, a park, never at his house. About a year after graduation, I met Jason at work. He was a few years older, kind, funny, and most importantly, he really saw me, not as an inconvenience or a burden, but as a person worthy of love and respect. 4 years flew by. Jason and I moved in together, adopted a cat named Muffin, and built a life filled with love and laughter. Then, on a random Tuesday evening as we were doing dishes after dinner, Jason turned to me and proposed. And just like that, I was engaged. As the initial excitement settled, the reality of wedding planning set in. Which brings us back to where this story began: me, surrounded by wedding invitations, grappling with the question of whether to invite Sarah. In the end, I decided to send an invitation to Dad alone. I couldn't bring myself to include Sarah, not after everything that had happened. As I sealed the envelope, I felt a mix of sadness and resolve. I was starting a new chapter in my life, and I wanted it to be free from the shadows of the past. A week after I sent out the invitations, my phone rang. It was Dad. I answered, expecting the usual awkward small talk. Instead, I got an earful of fury. "How dare you," he bellowed, not even bothering with a hello. "How could you disrespect Sarah like this? You invited me to your wedding but not her, after everything she's done for you." I couldn't help it. I laughed. A short, bitter laugh that seemed to shock Dad into silence. "Everything she's done for me," I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Dad, are you hearing yourself right now?" "She raised you for years," he shot back. "She put so much love and care into." "Love and care," I interrupted, my calm finally snapping. "When, Dad? When did she ever show me love or care? Was it when she made me wear second-hand clothes while she bought designer outfits? Or when she convinced you not to buy me a car for college? Oh, I know it must have been when she threw my birthday gift in the trash and kicked me out of her party." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a quieter voice, Dad said, "Natalie, I'm sure you're exaggerating. Sarah wouldn't." "Wouldn't what, Dad? Wouldn't treat me like crap for years? Wouldn't make me feel unwelcome in my own home? Wouldn't consistently prioritize her own wants over my needs? Because she did all of that and you let her." My voice was shaking now, years of pent-up hurt and anger pouring out. "You never stood up for me, Dad, not once. You always took her side, always believed her over me. Do you have any idea how that felt, to know that your own father would always choose his wife over you?" The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow. "Natalie, I had no idea. I never meant to. Oh God, what have I done?" I heard a choked sob from his end, and despite everything, my heart clenched. "I'm so sorry, Pumpkin," he continued, his voice thick with tears. "I've been a terrible father. I put Sarah first, I ignored your feelings, I failed you. Can you ever forgive me?" I felt my own eyes welling up. This was all I'd wanted to hear for years, but now that the moment was here, I didn't know how to react. I hesitated, torn between hope and caution. "I'll think about it, Dad. That's all I can promise right now." We ended the call soon after, both emotionally drained. Over the next few weeks, Dad made a real effort. He called regularly, asked about the wedding plans, even offered to help with the costs. Slowly, cautiously, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. Then, the day before the wedding, my phone rang again. It was Dad, and my stomach dropped at the sound of his voice. "Natalie," his voice hard. "It's Sarah, she had a heart attack. This is your fault. If you hadn't excluded her, if you hadn't stressed her out like this, I can't believe you'd do this to her. I won't be at your celebration. I hope you're happy." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. All the progress, all the hope I'd allowed myself to feel gone in an instant. As I cried in my fiancé's arms, I couldn't help but think, was this really it? Was this how my relationship with my father would end? On the eve of what should be the happiest day of my life. The morning I woke up with a mix of emotions: excitement for the day ahead, but also a lingering sadness about Dad's absence. As I sipped my coffee, trying to focus on the positive, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Sarah's social media page. Curiosity got the better of me, and I clicked on it. What I saw made my blood boil. There was Sarah, looking perfectly healthy, posting dramatic status updates about how hurt she was, how ungrateful I was, how she was recovering from a terrible shock. But in her photos, she was smiling, looking as put together as ever. As I scrolled through the posts, my phone rang. It was Carol, one of Sarah's old friends from the neighborhood. "Natalie? It's Carol. Look, I shouldn't be calling you, but you need to know something." Sarah. She faked the heart attack. I overheard her bragging about it to some friends. She did it to make sure your dad wouldn't come to your wedding. I'm so sorry, honey. I thanked Carol and hung up, my mind reeling. Part of me wanted to call Dad immediately to expose Sarah's lies, but then I stopped. What would be the point? He'd made his choice, time and time again. He'd chosen Sarah over me, believed her lies, let her mistreat me for years. This was just the final nail in the coffin. As I got ready for the wedding, surrounded by my mom, my stepsister Lily, and my bridesmaids, I pushed thoughts of Dad and Sarah out of my mind. This was my day, and I refused to let them ruin it. But there was still one problem. "Who's going to walk me down the aisle?" I asked, my voice small. Mom and Lily exchanged glances. Then Mom spoke up, "Honey, Robert would be honored to do it, if you'd like. He loves you like his own daughter, you know." I felt a lump in my throat. Robert, my stepdad, who'd been more of a father to me in many ways than my own dad. Who'd always supported me, always made me feel welcome and loved. "Really?" I asked, looking at Robert. He smiled warmly. "Nothing would make me prouder, Natalie, but only if that's what you want." In that moment I realized something important. Family isn't just about blood, it's about love, support, and being there for each other. Robert had been that for me, consistently for years. "I'd love that, Robert." "Thank you," I said, giving him a hug. The wedding was beautiful. As Robert walked me down the aisle, I saw Jason waiting for me, his face lit up with love. I saw my mom, Lily, and all our friends and family smiling and crying happy tears. In that moment, I knew I had all the family I needed right here. A few days after the wedding, as Jason and I were preparing to leave for our honeymoon, I decided to post some wedding photos online. Almost immediately, a nasty comment appeared under one of the pictures. "Look at that," Sarah's comment read. "Being walked down the aisle by a stranger while her own father wasn't even invited. Shameful." I stared at the comment, a familiar anger bubbling up inside me. But then I felt Jason's hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Nat?" he asked, concern in his eyes. I looked at my husband, then back at the phone. Suddenly, Sarah's words seemed small, petty, and utterly unimportant. "You know what? I am okay," I said, surprising myself with how much I meant it. "In fact, I'm better than okay." Without another thought, I blocked Sarah's account. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I blocked Dad's too. It was time to close that chapter of my life for good.